Oh dear. Hey guys, and welcome to the Coffee and Coding Podcast, the show where we discuss everything there is to know about app development. I'm your host Rob J, and in today's episode, I speak with app development veteran Brian Plummer. Over the past 10 years, Brian's worked with startups, he's helped rebuild the New York Times app from scratch, he's worked with Nike, and he's currently a senior developer at OKCupid. We talk about what it was like developing mobile apps in 2010, what it's like working for a big corporation like the New York Times, different approaches to code reviews, testing using fakes versus mocks, the benefits of GraphQL, and much, much more. Now on to the show. So before we get into today's episode, a little housekeeping. Firstly, there is now a Coffee and Coding Slack channel. Slack channel? I think the official term is Workspace. But either way, there is now a Coffee and Coding Slack. So if you're interested in chatting with like-minded developers or fellow listeners or me, you can join the Slack at coffeeandcodingpod.com/Slack. There's actually a few members in there already, so that's pretty exciting. So yeah, if you're interested, check that out. Secondly, someone recently hit me up on LinkedIn to ask me about talking to someone about Internet of Things, IoT. So I did a little research, and in a couple of weeks' time, I should be having a chat with a guest who knows all about IoT. Assuming that the conversation comes off, but we've been talking back and forth. So I think it's definitely going to happen. And it got me thinking. So if you have a topic you'd like me to dig into or a specific guest that you'd like to hear on the show, let me know and I'll see if I can make it happen. The best places to hit me up for that would be either LinkedIn, tweet me. I'm not very active on Twitter, but I'm very observant on Twitter. So if you want to tweet me or hashtag coffee and coding, and I'll find it. Or you can join the Slack channel, which I just mentioned, coffeeandcodingpod.com/Slack, and you can let me know there as well. And finally, you can now find all the links to everything discussed in this podcast and every podcast at coffeeandcodingpod.com/episode, whatever number that happens to be. So for this one, coffeeandcodingpod.com/episode 12. Now on to my conversation with Brian. So I guess the first thing is thank you very much for agreeing to be on the show. I've been looking through your LinkedIn, and so you have a ton of experience. Like you've been doing Android since 2010, I think, right?
That's correct.
Yeah, which is even before me, and I thought I was like pretty long in the tooth with Android. So, and then I've seen that you've done like a bunch of talks and you write articles, and so there's tons of stuff to dig into. But I guess the first thing that I'm kind of interested in is how did you get your start in development and how did you get into Android development? And then following on from that, what was it like getting into Android development in 2010? Because that was super early, right? That was like the start of mobile apps taking off.
Oh yeah, absolutely. That's a really great question. I got started in development when I was in university, and I started off being an industrial engineer, and I took a beginning computer class that all the engineers had to take, and I really enjoyed it. And there was going to be an additional class, a second class, where they were going to teach us Java, and I was really excited, and I wanted to take it. You had to have a declared major, and at that time I was undecided engineering, and as a little bit of a lark, I didn't know where the industrial engineering building was, but I knew where the College of Computing was. So I figured I'll just go and declare computer science. I'll change it later. And it kind of really stuck. I took this class on Java, and I really enjoyed it. And I found myself just possessed. I would walk around campus thinking about these programming problems, and I enjoyed it. And of course, I'd get my grade card, and it would kind of be reflective of that. The programming class would have an A, and the other grades weren't even close to that. And so I thought, I really like this. I can't imagine doing anything else, and I really enjoyed it. And I lived in Atlanta. I'm from Atlanta originally, and I was working as a web developer for AT&T when I graduated. I had the opportunity to move to New York, and at that time I was kind of just getting tired of, or I wasn't enjoying the web development, at least the stack that we were using. And at that time I just got the brand new Android phone, the Nexus one, I want to say, and it felt like that was the way of the future. It felt like making apps, putting apps on the App Store, software and writing applications for these mobile devices. It just seemed really exciting and new and fresh. And even starting in Android development in 2010, it still felt like the space was permeated with that. These developers, indie developers, putting apps out there, getting famous or making money, or it just seemed like there was a lot of room to do things and to learn things and to make a big impact. And it just felt really new and shiny, even though maybe the tooling wasn't quite there or there wasn't a large amount of these libraries that we have today. It still was really exciting, and it felt like you're on the cutting edge of something. And that's what really one of the things that really got me into mobile development, and it's kind of kept me in mobile development as well. I really enjoy the problems that we face, and I really like it.
Okay, awesome. So in terms of from where you started to today, I think I know the answer, but it's interesting because, like I said, you were in it before me. And I remember when I got into Android, we were still using Eclipse, and Eclipse I remember it just being terrible. But what was it like, I guess, from like when you started Android development, and how different was it building for those early versions as opposed to now?
I want to say one of the things that really attracted me to it was at least the openness of the platform. I was a Linux user for a really long time, and I was interested maybe in iOS development for a brief second, but then I realized you had to have a Mac, and at the time you had to pay them $100 for Xcode. Xcode wasn't free, on top of the $25. And I could download Eclipse and run an emulator on my Linux box and have it just all work. And I was a really big open source advocate. And I still believe that open source really helps us and solves a lot of our problems. So even though, talking to more about your question, it was a little frustrating. It was a little difficult. We had to do a lot of stuff by hand. For example, like image loading and image processing. You'd have to use an HTTP connection and get the bitmap and make sure that's appropriate size and scale it before you pull it up from disk, and all this song and dance. And it seemed a little cumbersome in a way, but just that instant gratification that we as developers feel. You hit that button, you have the code deployed, and you see it on the device, and it suddenly makes it all worthwhile. But it was a little difficult, and a lot of people would kind of roll their own threading libraries, for threading management, image management, and so it was it was a little rough. And I was really happy when Android Studio came along, and IntelliJ makes a really great product. In fact, that was one of the things when I came to the city. I was using Eclipse initially, and I got turned on to IntelliJ, and I really liked it. And so when they came out with Android Studio, it wasn't that much of a stretch for me to start using that.
But really for you at the start, it's kind of like inventing the wheel, right? Because like you said, back then you had to do everything yourself. Like now there's a go-to library. If you want to do networking, use Retrofit, or like maybe use Volley or whatever, but there's go-to. And back then I suppose it was a bit of Wild West. You had to roll your own for a lot of things.
It kind of felt like a miracle worker in a way. You'd have to, Google for answers, Stack Overflow. You would have a bunch of different options. You'd kind of have to see what would work, and then, which one of those seemed the less hacky, and, it just really seemed like you were kind of working magic in a way. And sometimes that was fun, and sometimes, when things didn't work out so good, it was, pretty difficult.
Yeah, I can imagine. Now it's just, you can just Google it and there's a tutorial showing you how to do exactly what you want to do. So I also wanted to touch on a little bit. You worked at TouchLab, which I assume was like your first kind of Android gig, right? And then since then, you've worked at New York Times, you worked for Nike, you're at OKCupid now. But I'm kind of interested in what was kind of, how did you find the experience working at TouchLab, which is like a mobile development studio, right? As opposed to where you work now, which is like you've worked for big corporations. I imagine it's very different.
Yeah, it absolutely is. It's very different. When I came to the city and I went to an Android meetup here, and actually I'm a big proponent of the meetups, but I was actually sitting next to a person and I said, hey, I'm looking for a job. I'm new to town. And it turned out to be Kevin Galligan, and he is the owner of TouchLab. And he says, why don't you, talk to me and give me a code sample and maybe come work for me. And so I started working for him, and it was really interesting doing consulting. There's good and there's bad, but one of the things I really liked about it is you're habituated to a bunch of different code bases, and you get experience looking at different code bases, and I thought that was really cool. And not only that, as soon as you kind of get tired of a project, you would typically kind of roll off one and on to the next one. So I really kind of like that pacing of it too. Some of the things I really enjoyed about it too was I would typically interface with a customer or even go and be on site with a customer too. So it really taught me how to present myself to prospective customers, or also talk about technical things to customers. And it really helped me, refine that ability. At the time, I want to say we were TouchLab was the only Android-only consulting shop here in the city. So that was kind of cool. We were Android only, so that was a good feeling to do that.
The stuff that you were developing, was it Android only apps, or were people splitting essentially their budget between you guys and then an iOS only studio?
So our basic bread and butter were companies that already had an iOS app. And then, maybe a year or so later, once they got the funding or had the market share, then they would engage us and say, okay, we need an Android app now. A lot of the target audience for these startups or people who would need an app were, Americans, and they're overwhelmingly, iPhone users, or even New Yorkers, were overly iPhone users. So that was our big bread and butter. And it was kind of neat. You'd be given the iOS source code and say, okay, make a clone of this, for better or for worse. But one of the cool things about it was I at least learned how to use Xcode. I at least was able to dig around through Objective-C, kind of an autonomous fashion to where someone could kind of give me an app or some specs and say, okay, kind of make an Android-y version of this. And I thought that was, really neat as well. It kind of helped me be a more well-rounded developer as well.
Yeah, see, I used to get that when I started the early days of development, and I always used to be like, I don't understand Objective-C. Can you just give me screenshots and like a really rough spec and I can do exactly what you want? But if you gave me an Xcode project, I'd just be like, just no idea. So then I guess the question is, if you're allowed to talk about it, kind of what did you work on at the New York Times, and kind of what was it like working there? And I guess I asked mostly because most of the companies that I've worked for are startups or, small freelance projects, right? So, you build an MVP or you build a product, whereas the New York Times is like, it's this big thing. And in my head, it's always like, imagine if I worked at a big company like that and I was the person that introduced the bug that made every single user's device crash, because it happens, right? And it's not like you've got one user, it's like you've got millions of users. So what was your experience like working there, and how did you find that?
Just like any large corporations, it had its issues, some bureaucracy, but it was very, very progressive, and I really enjoyed my time there. I would tell people that it's a lot like high school versus university. It seems like high school people are there because they have to be there, and university people are there because they want to be there. And at least that's how it felt at the Times. A lot of people that were there really enjoyed working there, and they enjoyed the mission that the New York Times does and what we were furthering. And that's kind of what it felt like, too. It felt like we were making a positive change for the better in the world. And that's something I really liked. As you mentioned, going from a startup to a big company, one of the interesting things about it is, when you're at a small company, you typically wear a bunch of hats. And, when you go to a larger corporation, the hats are kind of spread around. There's a team that does quality control. There's a team that does performance monitoring. There's a team that does releasing. And so that was kind of interesting to be in a situation where, suddenly you're just kind of focused on pure development. And when I started, they had an application that had been around for maybe 3 or 4 years. All my colleagues were relatively new. No one understood the application, and if something would break and we'd fix it, it would cause more bugs. And it was from the older days of Android, where there's a lot of hand-rolled libraries built into it, image management, thread pooling, some of the stuff I mentioned before. So I had a really good opportunity to rewrite the application and start from scratch. And I was a part of a small team that did that, and it was really great. And it was really nice to work on an application and put it out there, and to know that, you're furthering democracy, or, that, hundreds of thousands of people will be using it to get the news, using your app to get the news. And I thought that was really nice. Yeah. And it felt like I had a responsibility to try to make it, as performant and as nice as I could.
That's nice. I guess that's a really good way to look at it. Because it's like I don't know what the right word is, but there's a lot of times where you work on stuff and you're like, it's cool, but it's not important. It's just, something that's cool and it's going to give someone joy, but you're not going to change anything long term. And then I guess when you look at it the way that you look at it, that's a pretty nice way to look at things.
Yeah, absolutely. And that was one of the great, as I call it, intangibles that they offered, is that feel-good feeling that we're doing something.
So one of the things that I wanted to ask about, well, there's a couple of things, but I guess the first one is, before we get into like GQL, and I know you did a talk on code reviews and different things like that, is, so you've done a bunch of talks, right? And I've seen you've done some at DroidCon, like a whole bunch of different places. So I guess the question is, how and why did you start giving talks? And then how did you get yourself onto big events? Like DroidCon in the Android world is a big event. So like, how does that kind of work?
It's a really great question. It's one of those deals, if you would have told me that, you would enjoy giving talks, 10 years ago, I wouldn't have believed you. And I think that's how the majority of us feel. We feel scared. We feel really nervous about setting up and talking. I still get nervous and scared setting up and talking. And the real motivator here is typically, we have colleagues or people that we look up to who push us in good direction and provide positive encouragement for us. And, I had someone like that in my life who, provided positive encouragement. Hey, why don't you try to give a talk? And I did. And, as most people kind of suggest, is if you are interested in talking, or at least at a big conference, to start at a meetup. And that's kind of what I did. And I was really scared and nervous the very first talk I gave, and I felt like it did horrible. Even the second talk I think I gave, I even had like a joke slide in it, and it came up to the slide and like no one laughed. And but I found that I enjoyed it. Not only I enjoyed it, but it felt like I was making a difference, or at least communicating ideas and helping people. And that was kind of one of the big motivating factors for me, at least one of the things that really grabbed me for it. So as I mentioned before, I was a big proponent of the meetup, and I've been a very active member of the New York meetup since I've actually moved to the city, so I've been going like 10 years. And the person who runs the meetup also happens to run DroidCon, Kevin Galligan, as well. So after speaking at the meetup, there was some encouragement to, throw my hat into the DroidCon as well, and I did. So I gave that a try, and I really enjoyed that as well. And I think, submitting multiple talks to these conferences always really helps, being thorough. If you get rejected, that's okay too. I've applied to so many talks that I've gotten, rejected from. For every one that I've applied to, there's probably like a couple, that I didn't make it. And I would suggest that anyone who even remotely wants to talk, you absolutely should. In addition to the fear, a lot of people have this mindset that, oh, what am I going to contribute? Or what, I don't really have anything to say, or I don't have anything additional to talk about that. And that's not true. Even our personal experience can lend a lot to a certain type of problem. And even though maybe someone else has talked about that problem, it's not the same talk as if you gave it, because you are going to be able to give your own outlook and your own solutions and your own guidance to it. So I tell others, if you're even remotely interested, go for it. Try to find someone to help you practice your talks with. Start at the meetups. And, and like I said, the scariness and the fear kind of never goes away, but it gets better. And at the end of the day, you're helping others, and that's always good.
100%. Yeah. I feel like the idea that you don't have things to contribute is always a little bit of kind of imposter syndrome, because, I think I'm a fairly good developer, but I know there's a million that are better than me. So why should I be talking, or why should I be doing something when somebody else should be? But it's like you said, your perspective is always different. So even if you give the exact same talk, somebody might get something from something you say, and they might not get it from somebody else delivering the same information. So do you remember what your first meetup talk was?
Yes, and I think I was wrong. It had to do with custom scaling of images, and for some reason I'd overlooked the image view, adjust view bounds or something, and I was doing it myself, and I was talking about it. Or maybe it was going with the 555 image type to save space, but it was a bad idea, and it causes banding, and it's horrible.
Okay. So you've learned from those experiences, I guess. I
just want to mention something else too. I've been horribly wrong a good number of times in my life, and I'm sure I'm going to be horribly wrong in the future. And it's it's unfortunate when that happens, but all we can do is to say we're wrong and move on with our life and learn our lesson. So
yeah,
that happens.
It's part of the learning experience, right? It's not any different from when you're a junior developer, and if you were to look at the code you wrote 10 years ago now, you'd be like, oh my God, why did I do this? So, this is how we learn.
Lately, one of the things I've really enjoyed is just the power of abstraction, and I've really started to really enjoy fakes. And there's a talk about fakes versus mocks.
I saw was it an article that you wrote, right? So I guess that's a good question. So what is your thoughts on fakes versus mocks?
Mocks maybe have their place, but I think, fakes are really awesome. I'm working in a current code base, or when I started, they had an issue of statics and overuse of statics. And when I mean statics, I mean static constructs that were stateful, that would hit the network. And of course, that's not really a good idea. So I've been really, hitting the head of, abstraction and espousing that. So I've just found it really, really easy, at least from a unit test, just how easy it is to use fakes. And I'm sure, Maccaro and PowerMock has its places, but we've all spent time on the argument matchers in Maccleod, trying to get stuff to work, stubbing out, I guess, static rules for things. And it's just really difficult. And sometimes, one example, we had a failing test a few months back, or a flaky test, I should say. Flaky test.
Yeah, I'm familiar.
And, digging a little deeper, it turned out it was because we hadn't considered time as a dependency. And it was a really great learning lesson because I showed the team that not only, tests are flaky for a reason, but you can even take time as a dependency and abstract it and make it independent of the machine that it's running on. Just by using an interface and an abstraction instead of calling system.currentTime, milliseconds. And so I've just been really impressed personally with just the power of abstraction and what it gives us.
That's really interesting because primarily for testing, I've always worked with mocks, which is it's fine. It's like you said, I don't know the time difference. It probably takes longer because you're not totally in control of what's going on. And then you miss out I didn't return this value and I didn't return this value. But have you worked with mock? I don't know how you're supposed to say it, but it's MOCKK because I really like that over Mockito. It's much, much nicer.
Yeah, it is, and I've used it a little bit, and it is really a great library, and I think it is definitely an improvement over the older one. I think the questions we have to ask ourselves, at least when using some of these, and again, I'm not anti-mocking. I just think that we should ask ourselves these questions. If we're in the position of having to mock these static things, is that a code smell? I think with any great power, there's lots of some responsibility, and I think and it's a very, very powerful tool, and of course, it has its place, but I think, we should also be asking, are we overusing some of the aspects of this? Yeah,
I think to your point, if you have to mock statics, probably it's the code smell. There's very few scenarios where it wouldn't be. I mean, the only times I can think is if it's not is when it's things that are out of your control, where you didn't code the static and then you have to, and then mock comes into play. But then it gets super confusing as well because that's how you end up with flaky tests, right? Whereas you've written the tests and the mocks look perfect, but for whatever reason, and you don't know why, they don't work. But you don't know that they don't work. So then it just takes I suppose if you're doing fakes, then you know exactly what's happening because you wrote the code. So I wanted to ask about the talk that you gave about GQL, which was basically, I guess, what are your thoughts on it? Because I've only recently started working with GQL and, I think it's pretty cool and I can definitely see the benefits for it. So I guess, what's your thoughts on GQL as a whole and kind of where it fits into app development? And then I guess, where do you see it going? Because it seems like it's potentially the future, but, there's always a new thing. So what do you think?
My first experience with GraphQL was probably about 4 or 5 years ago when I was at New York Times, when the Apollo was first starting to make its client, and we first started checking it out, and we would really stress test it and really use it, and this was before it really became feature-rich like it is today, or at least I think it's feature-rich. So I've kind of been messing around with it for 4 or 5 years at this point. I've had some jobs where I haven't really used it, some where I have. And when it was initially pitched to us, or when I initially heard, it was definitely had that salesy kind of a feel, like it's going to solve all of our problems. We're not going to need REST anymore. It's going to make our lives as developers a lot easier. And I think some of that's true. I don't know if it's all completely true. I think the Apollo client is actually very feature-rich, and there's a lot of cool stuff in it that you get for free. Compile time validation, the reflection-free parsing, which is really awesome. It has a really cool cache, a normalized cache, and a lot of neat stuff kind of built into it. As far as the specification goes, it's kind of debatable. And after using it all this time, there's some things I like, some things I don't. A lot of times, I guess, it seems like the majority maybe, or I guess the best use case for it is maybe for open organizations who have a lot of data and they want people just to be able to hit their endpoints and just do queries. So with private companies, it's a little bit more constrained. You typically would have a GraphQL instance, and then you typically have to jump through hoops to kind of make it secure. So much so to where maybe you have allow list and blocking list for certain types of queries. And, as part of our process, maybe, we would write a new query, but for that to even work in production, it has to, go through some sort of process to be allowed. And, that's just another hoop. And I guess the big proponents of the GraphQL have typically been the server developers. At least in my experience, has typically come from the server side, for better or for worse. the server developers really love it, and they typically, want to push it on us. So that's been kind of an interesting observation. Does it solve all of our problems? I'm not really sure. I still like REST. I still use REST for some things, and REST has its place. And I think it just really depends upon the teams that use it and how much active development is going, into these systems. If you have a team that's really focused on the REST endpoints, if it's not broke, why fix it?
I think that's fair. From a mobile perspective, what do you think is the coolest thing that you could do with the GraphQL client? Because some of the stuff I've seen, so like the caching's cool. You get that for free. I feel like if you cache a list and then you just want to retrieve one item from that list from the cache, the documentation for that doesn't seem great. And at least from what I found, so it's one of those you have to kind of trial and error, but that's cool. I mean, I guess if you was going to like super geek out and try and sell it to a mobile developer, like what's the coolest thing that you could do?
Compile time validation is really nice. The fact that using the caching can sort of almost replace your repository layer if you want. It can also respect the HTTP headers. So if you have a really awesome backend team and you don't even want to deal with the caching on the client, then the backend team can handle the HTTP caching portion of it for you. And from a development standpoint, they're really responsible and
responsive.
I
think that's the word you were going for.
Yeah. And, it's just a really, active development. And the developers that work on it are really responsive and approachable, and they seem like they really enjoy it. So I think it's a tool that's really well maintained and that's very active development. I'm sorry, I don't have anything like off the top of my head that's like super exciting that I can think of that it does. No, that's
totally fine. To people that don't know GQL, the three things that you just listed is just going to blow their mind. So then I wanted to touch on one other thing which you talked about, because I was watching this today and you gave a talk about code reviews, which I thought was super interesting. And I kind of just want to get, I guess, like the cliff notes of your opinion on code reviews and kind of advice. Yeah, I guess advice that you could give to developers that aren't super familiar or aren't super confident with them. Because, I've worked at a lot of companies that do code reviews, in my opinion, well. And then a lot of them where a code review isn't a code review. Somebody just ticks it and says it compiles and off you go. And then you've got other places where people are super picky and they're like, oh, there's a space here. You need to get rid of this space. You shouldn't do this. You should do this. And they don't actually want to change the code. They just want it to be as if they wrote it themselves. So what's your thoughts on that? And what would be your advice or feedback to people that aren't familiar or that are looking to improve the way they do code reviews?
Right on. I really enjoy reviewing code just for the sole reason that it's almost like an algorithmic baby for me. I'm to this point now where kids are cute, but I still don't really want one. And it's an opportunity to hold a child for a few minutes until I get tired of it and I can give it to someone else, And I really enjoy reviewing code, and I have for the longest time, and I couldn't figure out, it seemed like that was a little bit unusual with my peers. And not only that, I personally have a hard time, it's all really difficult for us to, not only to receive feedback, but also to give appropriate feedback. And I think, at the end of the day, we're all people, with feelings, and, there's a human element to it as well. And as you kind of mentioned, it's not always necessarily about being right or making the code, look like you've written it. So one of the things that I really like to do, or at least I like to believe in, is identifying, what's a cardinal sin and what isn't. If a cardinal sin is something that's, obviously very wrong, it's something that would cause the app to crash, it's something that would be a detriment to the user. And then kind of everything else that's not a cardinal sin is kind of almost a nitpick in a way. And I think framing this dialogue, this conversation in such a way to where, you're asking someone, not necessarily telling them, but, asking them, could you consider doing this or consider doing that? Back to the cardinal sins. So realizing that, some of this matters and some of it doesn't really helps give perspective to the review process. And one of the things I like to do personally is, identify that, but also not to be oppressive and to communicate that and say, hey, I noticed this thing. Have you considered it doing this way or not? If you don't feel like it, that's okay. You can take care of it later or not today. And I think that's a very important idea, is to not be oppressive and to try to understand what we want to accomplish. And that is, making code that doesn't have any of these cardinal sins, and everything else can kind of slide. Something I've been trying to get at least better about recently, maybe leading more by example.
I was going to ask, so in terms of cardinal sins, are they your cardinal sins or are they cardinal sins that are decided by the team, for example?
I think maybe more of a looser definition, and maybe what I have in my head would be a cardinal sin. Something that would maybe, again, be a detriment to a user using the product, or maybe would introduce a crash, or, something that was really, really obviously wrong that should be fixed.
So then I guess hypothetical question. So let's say I issue you a pull request and I've got if else this, if else that, if else whatever, and the conditions inside those if statements are like something and not something else, right? So in my head, or at least if I was actually going to write that code, those conditions would be one method that returns a Boolean that says, if this thing is true, then you can do this, right? And I probably also wouldn't do if else, I'd do a switch, or I'd do a when statement if we're talking about Kotlin or whatever. So let's say I submitted that pull request to you. What would be the feedback that you would give to me?
I would say consider approaching this with idiomatic Kotlin. Here's an example. If you're stressed today, don't worry about it. This is a nitpick. If you just want to merge it, go for it. If you want to correct it, that's cool too.
Okay, cool. So you'd basically say like the code is valid, so it's good to go. But if you want to make it nicer or more maintainable, or if you just want to see a different way to do it that's cleaner, you could do this. But it's not a forceful request changes. Please change it to this.
Correct. And I think a lot of times like a style guide really helps us in these situations. I think in that way, the rules don't seem arbitrary to people. And I think that's one of the other issues too, is when people say, oh, well, you should be doing it like this. It's like, why? And I think, coming together as a team and, writing some layer above the syntax is typically kind of helpful, at least as some guiding posts for us as developers. I also think, syntax stuff shouldn't really be a part of the review process as well. That's one of those things that really can be automated and, pointing out, hey, you got this extra space here, or, hey, I think those sorts of things can be, automated away and, relieve us of the burden of that during the code review.
Okay, awesome. Okay. All right, so I've got two questions left. I think 2 questions. I don't know. We'll count them when we're done. So the first thing that I want to ask is, what machine do you use to work from?
It's a company-issued MacBook laptop. I mentioned I'm a big fan of Linux. Unfortunately, though, a few jobs back, someone gave me a MacBook Air, and the form factor was so nice. And I haven't used Linux in a while. And being a New York City person, I don't have a lot of room in my tiny apartment for other computers. So.
Gotcha. Okay, cool. All right, that's fair enough. I was thinking you might say Linux because you mentioned it, but if somebody gave me a free Mac, I might use it as well. So, and then the other question that I ask everybody, which I'm interested to hear your opinion on, is what do you think separates an okay developer from a great developer?
Oh, that's a really great question. I think the desire to maybe help and elevate others is a really big difference. I think someone who's a really accomplished person and they're a really great coder, if they're doing this in a vacuum, then they're just a really good coder. I think most of the great software developers that I've interacted with have really cared about helping out their teammates, cared about helping out their peers, and I think that's really infectious. And I think helping others out and doing that is a really big difference. Learning those skills. You don't have to be a people person. You don't have to be charismatic to do this. You just have to have a willingness and a desire to help and make things better. And I'm a big believer in that. And I think, by helping others, we also, the knowledge gets solidified in our head. But that makes us, that's what makes a great developer in my mind.
Awesome. That's a really good answer. And then I guess the last question is, where would you like people to find you? Where can I direct them to? GitHub, LinkedIn, all that good stuff.
Twitter would be good. My Plummer Makes handle, and mostly for Android facing stuff. So.
Big thanks to today's guest, Brian Plummer. You can find Brian on LinkedIn. You can find links to his talks and articles at coffeeandcodingpod.com/episode 12, and you can connect with him on Twitter at plummermakes. As always, you can find everything we talked about in this episode in the show notes. If you like the show, tell a friend, and don't forget to subscribe and leave us a 5-star rating. It's much appreciated. And if you really like the show, you can support it with a coffee donation at coffeeandcodingpod.com/buymecoffee. Caffeine is literally what fuels this podcast. If you'd like to connect with like-minded developers, you can do so in our Slack channel. And finally, you can follow me on your favorite social media platform at lowcarbrob. You can find all the links to everything I've just said in the show notes or at coffeeandcodingpod.com. Thank you for listening, and I'll catch you on the next episode of the Coffee and Coding Podcast.